Good morning. I want to tell you a story about reconciliation and obedience. My story begins here in Florence, in this room. It begins with Terry Phillips asking us to volunteer for Undivided. Specifically, Terry was looking for diverse participants to make it work here in Florence. And right about that time, I got a nudge from my wife, and she looked at me and she said, "Are you going to sign up for this?" And I looked at her, I said, "Me?" I said, "Honey, I don't think I'm the kind of diversity they're looking for." Friends, my name is Diaz. I'm Cuban, and I grew up in Miami, Florida. Miami's a very diverse place, but most of the people there look like me. The mayor was Cuban, my elementary school principal, middle school, high school principal, they were all Cubans. The point is that I didn't grow up as a minority, and so I didn't feel like I can offer a minority's perspective to Undivided. But I went to college at Eastern Kentucky, so that was a little different. And I thought, well, maybe I can bring that to the table, so I signed up for Undivided. And I won't tell you much about it because we're getting ready to start that up again, but I will tell you that Undivided will bring the spirit of reconciliation into your heart. And that was important for me because right about the time that this was going on, Cuba was in the news regularly. And if you've been paying attention to the news, you know that things have been happening, and my friends have been asking me questions. They say, "Louis, what do you think about the president visiting Cuba for the first time in 50 years? What do you think about ending the embargo? What do you think about normalizing relations with Cuba?" And these are all very fair questions to ask, but for me, they're very difficult questions to respond to. And they're difficult because I was actually born in Cuba. My grandfather was part of the first wave of Cubans that left in the 60s. And when he left, he tried to take his family with him, my aunt, my grandmother, and my father. The government wouldn't let my father leave. At the time, he was 15, and he was due to enter the military, and everyone had to serve their time in the military, so they just wouldn't let him leave. By the time my father was able to leave Cuba, my grandfather got him out. It was 1980. By then, he had met my mother, had my brother and I. And when he left, the government took all property that he had on my grandfather's farm, the house that he lived in. And so you can imagine that I was raised to have absolutely no trust in the Cuban government. I was raised to believe that communism is bad. And so it's all very difficult for me to process. But by this time, we were engaged in our brave journey. And although I was born in Cuba, I've never visited Cuba, and I have family there that I've never met. And so I thought my heading is going to be to visit Cuba. And that's not, as nice as that sounds, Cuba doesn't recognize my American citizenship, so there's this fear that if I visit, can they keep me from leaving? And so there's a little tension there, but I said, this is what I'm going to do. And as we came to the end of the brave journey, I got a call from a business partner, and she said, "Louis, there is going to be a summit at the White House in D.C., and the summit's going to be followed by a reception at the Cuban embassy. If you are interested, I can get you an invitation." And I was just absolutely floored. I thought, man, what a good father. I mean, you talk about confirmation that your heading is the right heading. I thought, man, I can go to D.C., I can go to the Cuban consulate's office, I can get all the paperwork that I need to go to Cuba, and on top of that, I get to visit the White House. I don't even have to win like the Super Bowl or the World Series to do it. I mean, this is pretty cool stuff. So I got all my paperwork together, birth certificate, passport, all that, took it to D.C. I bought a plane ticket on May 25th. I flew over there, and on the plane, I just was completely feeling God's grace. I felt like I was on a path that he had set me on, and I was just following and obeying. And when I got to D.C., I went to the Cuban consulate's office, and as easily as things came together here in Kentucky, they just started to fall apart in D.C. When I went into the consulate's office, it felt like Black Friday in a big box retail store. I mean, it was completely impenetrable. The line was unmanageable, and it became very clear to me that whatever I thought I was going to get from them that day wasn't going to happen. I wasn't going to get any kind of visa, any kind of permission, nothing. And I was very discouraged by that. I thought, God, if you're bringing me here to D.C. so that I can visit Cuba, how am I going to fulfill this brave journey if I can't even get the paperwork? But I set those ideas aside. I put them in the parking lot of ideas because I thought, you're going to the White House, so let's just focus on that. I went to the White House. They brought me in. They took me into what was a small auditorium, and there I sat with about 100 business leaders from all over the country. And government regulators were talking about the different changes that had happened over the last year with Cuba. They were telling me, this change, that change, you can do this, but you can't do that. But then quickly the meeting turned into a recruiting session. And what the regulators were doing is they were recruiting the business leaders in that room to try to encourage Congress to eliminate the embargo. And immediately I was just offended. I couldn't believe that after all that my family had been through, that I'm sitting there in the White House and actively encouraged by the government to just turn my back on that and try to engage Cuba. I left the White House just upset. I felt disenfranchised. I didn't know what to do with it. I went to my hotel room and I just prayed. I said, God, what's this about? You know, I thought you brought me to D.C. to work on paperwork, to get visas, but engage Cuba? How am I going to reconcile that? And as I sat there, the word reconcile just completely brought the undivided experience into the room with me. It brought my undivided friends in there with me. And I thought about how during that journey, we asked white people and black people to sit together and talk and just have a conversation, to set aside a history of racial tension and just talk and engage each other. And as I sat there, I was completely convicted by my hypocrisy, and that I'm very comfortable asking a black friend and a white friend to sit together and talk about things and engage each other. But when it came to myself, I really wasn't that interested in engaging Cuba or reconciling Cuban Americans here in the United States with Cuba. And so I just sat back and I prayed. I said, God, I don't know what you're doing here, but if this is the path that you're taking me down, please light the road and give me the courage to follow. That afternoon, I had a ticket to the Cuban embassy to visit, and so I said, I'm going to go and I'm going to make the best of this. And I was a little uneasy going in there. I didn't know what to expect. I'd never been to an embassy before, but I went. When I got there, I'm happy to say that I was immediately put at ease. When I walked in to the right, there was a bar. And the bar was, they named it the Ernest Hemingway Bar, and the only thing they served at that bar was mojitos. So I'm like, all right, this is cool. Very comfortable environment. Then there was a guy, he was just walking around with a box of cigars, and he was offering them as if they were hors d'oeuvres. And the embassy is not a smoke-free zone. So it was a very comfortable environment, so I said, okay, I'm going to make it a point to talk to the ambassador. I don't know what to say, I'm just going to walk up and introduce myself. So I did. I said, Mr. Ambassador, hi, my name is Louis. I live in Kentucky, but I was born in Cuba. And he asked me, well, where were you born? I told him, and he said, well, that's where I'm from. That's where I was born. And immediately there was a sense of familiarity that you just can't explain, and he started to introduce me to other people that worked at the embassy, and we started to engage in conversation. And by the end of the night, I was one of the last people to leave the embassy. When I left, there was still tension in my heart because I knew that I just engaged in conversation with people that were just people who were just trying to make their world better. But I also knew that I had to somehow explain this to my father. And then I wondered, man, are my friends in South Florida going to think I'm some kind of a communist because I'm going to have this conversation with these folks? And so as I processed that, I was looking for a way to explain it to people in South Florida and explain the way that I was feeling, and I came across a poem that I thought was very appropriate. It's appropriate because the poem was written by Jose Marti, who is to Cubans what George Washington is to Americans. And I want to share a translated version of that poem with you today. The poem goes as follows. I have a white rose to tend, in July as in January. I give it to the true friend who offers his faithful hand to me. And for the cruel one whose blows break the heart by which I live, thistle nor thorn do I give. For him too, I have a white rose. And I found this to be very appropriate because I think this poem is very rooted in the kingdom. Folks, you respond to friendship with friendship. You respond to division and hatred with reconciliation and friendship. For me, the conversation that started at the embassy, it's continued. I've kept an open line of dialogue, and the things that I'm focusing on today with the folks at the embassy is how is it that I can get the ambassador to come to Kentucky on an official visit? What is it that I can do here to make Kentucky a leader in economic trade with Cuba if and when that becomes possible? I don't have a roadmap for any of this stuff. This is all pie in the sky ideas, but I'm very grateful that the spirit of reconciliation has allowed me to even think in this way and to engage in this path. And so this morning, I ask all of you, what is it that the spirit of reconciliation can do in your heart? To whom or what can you offer a white rose? Thank you.